Hamish Macbeth had always liked Christmas morning for its quiet absurdity, the way the world seemed to pause for a few hours and let people believe in harmless miracles. But this year, the snow-laden streets of Lochdu were hushed with a different sort of dread. By 7 o'clock the air was crisp enough to make every breath visible, but the usual festive cheer was replaced by murmurs of shock and disbelief. Old Mrs. MacLeod's cottage at the edge of the village, where she had lived alone for decades, had become the epicentre of an incident so bizarre that even Hamish's well-trained mind struggled to make sense of it. He arrived just as the first villagers, cheeks pink from the cold and faces etched with curiosity, began to gather near the low stone wall surrounding the MacLeod property. The front door was ajar, swinging faintly with the winter wind, and the familiar smell of pine logs mixed unsettlingly with something acrid and metallic. Hamish stepped carefully over the snow-crusted path and ducked under the low doorway. Inside, the scene was almost theatrical in its strangeness. Mrs. MacLeod lay on the floor of her sitting room, eyes wide open, a pool of dark blood spreading beneath her like ink dropped on parchment. Yet what caught Hamish's attention first, and held it, was not the body, but a single small green ornament resting on the mantel above the fireplace. A hand-painted bauble in the shape of a tiny owl, its eyes staring blankly, perched as though it had been placed with intent. The room itself told contradictory stories. Nothing appeared disturbed. Her teacups sat neatly on the sideboard, the fire was just embers, and the furniture remained undisturbed. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the thick layer of snow outside that didn't belong to the MacLeod family, or what Hamish could identify as the regular visitors, bar nothing, except for the oddity of that green owl. It seemed utterly meaningless, yet somehow purposeful, a cryptic message meant for anyone clever enough to understand. Hamish crouched beside Mrs. MacLeod and examined the scene. The wound was precise, almost surgical, as though inflicted by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. But there was no weapon to be found, no smear of blood leading to an obvious suspect, nothing that suggested a motive. Christmas gifts remained neatly stacked under the tree, unopened, innocent in the face of sudden death. He moved through the room. Hamish noted that the windows were tightly shut, and the only door that could have provided ingress or egress showed no signs of tampering. He frowned, tapping his fingers against the windowsill. "Locked from the inside, but," he murmured, mostly to himself. This was turning out to be a locked-room mystery, the sort he didn't often encounter in Lochdu. It was a crime that seemed, on the surface, impossibly simple. A single victim, no witnesses, no clear entry. But the devil, as always, lay in the details. The villagers whispered outside, their voices rising and falling like the wind. Someone had apparently seen a shadow moving in the night. Another claimed to have heard a distant cry that could have been a cat, or perhaps something far more sinister. Hamish had learned long ago not to trust these second-hand accounts entirely, though sometimes a fragment of truth hid within them. He turned his attention back to the mantel, where the little green owl sat like a sentinel. Oddly, the ornament had a thin coating of dust on its base, as if it had been undisturbed for weeks. Yet Mrs. MacLeod had been known to rearrange her decorations daily during December. Why leave this one untouched? And why leave it alone when everything else suggested order? He noted the clock on the wall. It had stopped precisely at 2:37 a.m. Time, Hamish knew, could be as telling as the blood on the floor. He crouched again, his eyes tracing the faint outline of footprints on the rug, barely visible under the dim light, almost as if they had been deliberately brushed away. It was subtle, but the subtlety suggested intent, a calculated choice rather than negligence. Whoever had done this wanted to be sure the discovery would baffle anyone who came looking. And yet, why a Christmas morning murder? Why leave the house so neat, the tree untouched, the small green owl on the mantel? Hamish sighed, his breath fogging in the chill. The case was deceptively simple. A murder in a locked room with no apparent motive and a single strange clue, but he could feel the complexity coiling around the edges like smoke. There was something about the owl, he was certain, that mattered. though its meaning was hidden behind layers of ordinary domesticity and a life meticulously lived. Somewhere in the ordered quiet of Mrs. MacLeod's home, a message waited to be unravelled, one that would pull Hamish into the dark heart of a crime that had begun as innocuously as any Christmas morning, yet promised to reveal secrets none in Lochdu could have anticipated. He rose, brushing snowflakes from his coat, and allowed himself a moment to glance outside at the gathering villagers, their faces bright with curiosity but shadowed by unease. Somewhere between the half-light of dawn and the first stirring of panic, Hamish knew he would have to tease meaning from chaos, unravel threads that seemed randomly scattered, and confront a criminal clever enough to hide in plain sight. And as he stared once more at the green owl, he realized that this Christmas morning, at least for him, would not end with carols and gifts, but with questions that demanded answers and a puzzle that refused to be ignored. Hamish Macbeth didn't wait for the constable from the Inverness office to arrive. He knew from experience that official procedures often moved like molasses, and in a case like this, time was a slippery accomplice to the guilty. He walked slowly around Mrs. MacLeod's sitting room, letting his eyes trace every angle, every shadow. The constable, a young man from the mainland who had never seen snow deeper than a few inches and seemed bewildered by the village's winter quiet, had arrived shortly after Hamish and was busy questioning the neighbours through the doorway. They whispered hesitantly, glancing at the body, their voices tentative, their breaths forming clouds in the cold air. Hamish could hear the questions being asked and the answers offered, mostly vague, sometimes contradictory, but the patterns of truth and deception often hid bar in what was left unsaid, not in the words themselves. Hamish's gaze returned to the small green owl. Its placement was too deliberate for it to be random, yet the dust at its base suggested it had not been moved for weeks. He crouched again, noting something subtle he had missed before, a faint smudge on the glass of the front window, small and almost imperceptible. He pressed a gloved finger to it, careful not to leave prints. It wasn't a handprint. It was far too small. A child's? Perhaps. But who and why would reach up here, brushing against the cold glass in the dead of night, without leaving any other trace? He made a mental note and moved toward the small sideboard near the fireplace, where the teacups and saucers sat untouched. One cup, however, was slightly tilted, as if nudged or lifted and then returned in a hurry. It was a tiny detail, easily dismissed, yet it spoke of a presence that had not been accounted for in the villagers' statements. A creaking floorboard drew his attention next. He followed the sound to the hallway leading to the bedrooms, noticing a faint scuff on the polished floorboards. Someone had moved quickly here, but not violently. Hamish's eyes narrowed. The movement suggested a calculated intention, someone who knew the layout of the house perfectly, someone who could navigate without disturbing anything else. That ruled out an intruder from outside who had entered through force. The more he looked, the more the murder seemed to whisper that it had been committed by someone Mrs. MacLeod trusted, or at least someone who knew her routines intimately. Hamish stepped back into the sitting room just as the constable fussed with his notebook, asking the villagers for alibis. "Seen anything unusual last night?" he called, and received the usual mixture of conjecture and superstition. Hamish ignored the answers for now, focusing instead on the SBR bar. Uttal reactions. One of the villagers, young Ailid Mackenzie, a girl who helped Mrs. MacLeod with her shopping, lingered by the doorway, fidgeting with her scarf. Her eyes were wide, but they flicked repeatedly to the owl on the mantel, betraying more than fear. An almost imperceptible hesitation, a pause that suggested knowledge she shouldn't have. Hamish made a discreet note of it. Sometimes the smallest gestures revealed far more than spoken words. Returned to the owl, examining its painted features in the dim light. The eyes, black and glossy, seemed almost accusatory, and then, at the base, something tiny caught the corner of his eye, a minute scratch barely visible, as though someone had tried to leave a mark or remove a detail. He crouched lower, peering through his magnifying lens. There was a faint trace of green paint on the mantel edge that didn't match the rest of the ornament, as if it had been handled clumsily before being placed there. Hamish straightened slowly, his mind working through possibilities. Whoever had arranged this scene wanted it to confuse, to mislead. The owl was not just decoration, it was a signal. But what signal, and to whom? The corner of his eye, he noticed the door to the kitchen was slightly ajar, a sliver of light cutting into the otherwise muted room. Moving quietly, he pushed it open, half expecting another body, or a more obvious clue. Instead, he found the mundane. Spoons neatly in a drawer, the kettle still half full, but on the counter, a single envelope addressed to Mrs. MacLeod in a careful, unfamiliar hand. Hamish lifted it, noting the absence of a postmark, the crispness of the paper. It was deliberate. Someone had wanted it to arrive, or perhaps to be found on this morning. He opened it carefully and read the brief note inside, a single line written in neat, precise handwriting. Some truths are hidden where you bar. East expect. A shiver ran down his spine. A taunt, a warning, or a clue only the sharpest eye could follow. Hamish pocketed the note and turned back to the sitting room, eyes scanning once more. Every detail, every subtlety, was a piece of the puzzle. The owl, the smudged glass, the tilted teacup, Ailid's nervous glances, the mysterious envelope. They formed a web of hints and half-truths. He knew that the solution would not reveal itself in a rush of discovery, but in patient, meticulous observation. Already, the first threads of deception were unravelling, yet the full picture remained tantalizingly out of reach. Somewhere within these small, deliberate inconsistencies lay the key to understanding not just who had killed Mrs. MacLeod, but why, and what secret Christmas morning had been meant to conceal. Hamish Macbeth stepped back into the chill of the morning air, leaving the warm, quiet horror of Mrs. MacLeod's sitting room behind him. The villagers had formed a hesitant semicircle in the snow outside, their breath forming small clouds that disappeared almost as quickly as they appeared. The constable had begun the predictable routine of questioning, but Hamish knew better than to rely solely on rehearsed statements. People said what they thought they ought to say, or what they believed would protect them, and sometimes what they left unsaid mattered far more than their words. Started with Ailid Mackenzie, who lingered near the edge of the gathering, hands fidgeting with the fringe of her scarf. Lid, Hamish said gently, his voice low but firm. Tell me exactly what you did last night. She swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the house, then back to him, and began hesitantly. I helped Mrs. MacLeod with her shopping yesterday afternoon. Then I went home to help my mother prepare for the Christmas morning service. I didn't come back here until this morning. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something, fear perhaps, or guilt. Hamish watched her closely, noting how her fingers twisted her scarf in a way that suggested she was telling the truth but withholding detail. Did you see anyone else come to the house last night? He asked, keeping his tone casual, almost conversational. Ailid shook her head a little too quickly. No one, she said. No, I didn't see anyone. The streets were quiet. Hamish's brow furrowed. Quiet streets in Lochdu weren't unusual, but the eagerness in her denial was almost too perfect. He filed the observation away. Sometimes the truth hides in overcompensation. Next he approached Hamish Sinclair, the butcher's son, and a known gossip in the village, whose cheerful demeanour seemed almost incongruous with the sombre occasion. Hamish, it's awful, he said, rubbing his hands together, though they were already red and numb from the cold. I heard nothing last night, honest. Slept right through. Didn't see a soul. Hamish noted the same inconsistency as before. Sinclair's claim of sleeping through the night, while others reported faint noises in the vicinity, seemed convenient, almost rehearsed. Hamish allowed a thin smile to flicker. Some people were too eager to cooperate, either from fear, pride, or a secret to conceal. As he moved through the small group, Hamish's eyes caught subtle shifts, a nervous cough here, a sideways glance there. Old Mr. Fraser, who lived next door, was particularly reticent, his hands buried deep in his pockets, lips pursed. I heard a noise, he admitted finally, his voice gruff. Maybe A thump or a bump could have been the wind. His hesitation betrayed uncertainty, and Hamish made note. He sensed Mr. Fraser knew more than he was admitting, but fear, habit, or loyalty kept him guarded. Hamish paused, allowing the villagers to digest his calm scrutiny before turning his attention to Mrs. MacLeod's distant relatives, who had come to join the holiday morning only to discover tragedy. Their statements were courteous but clipped, each one giving a different account of their arrival and the last time they had seen her alive. One claimed to have checked on the decorations the previous evening. Another insisted they had gone to bed early, never noticing anything amiss. The contradictions were minor, almost trivial, but Hamish knew better. In those tiny inconsistencies, the shifting of times, the subtle hesitation in tone, he could already sense the undercurrents of motive, resentment, fear of inheritance, long-held grudges thinly veiled beneath polite words. He returned to the Green Owl, now watching from the mantel, and felt the pattern emerging. Every detail in the room, every carefully chosen word, every hesitation or overstatement, formed a network of half-truths and lies. Hamish realized the murderer's strategy was as much psychological as physical. They had counted on the village's natural shock and deference to mislead the investigation, to bury the truth beneath layers of polite conversation and assumed innocence. He listened carefully as a few villagers speculated aloud, some claiming the wind could have knocked over objects, others hinting that perhaps an outsider was responsible, but their voices only underscored the inconsistencies he had already noted. Hamish made a mental inventory of each statement, each contradiction, each too-perfect alibi. The eagerness of some witnesses to assist, the cautious withholding of detail by others, the nervous glances, the subtle gestures, all these were clues in themselves. The murderer, he knew, was already shaping the story by the way others spoke, allowing their own misdirection to seep into every account. The detective's mind worked quietly, fitting PBR pieces together, not forcing them, but letting the contradictions illuminate the truth. Somewhere amid these carefully spun half-truths lay the path to understanding why Mrs. MacLeod had died, who had killed her, and what secret, hidden even from the sharpest eyes, had turned a quiet Christmas morning into a tableau of carefully orchestrated deception. Hamish Macbeth returned to the warmth of the cottage, the cold biting at his cheeks as he pondered the threads of information he had gathered so far. The villagers' statements, while outwardly innocuous, carried subtle hints that nagged at his instincts. He paced slowly around the sitting room, eyes sweeping the familiar furniture now cast in an ominous light, and allowed himself a moment to consider the intricate tangle of potential motives. In Lochdu, motives were rarely as simple as money or malice. They were often woven from years of quiet grudges, half-forgotten slights, and simmering envy. Mrs. MacLeod, for all her reputation for kindness and discretion, had lived long enough to be entwined in a dozen such quiet conflicts. Bartruge thought first of Aelid Mackenzie. The girl was helpful and loyal, but there was a subtle defensiveness in her voice when asked about last night. Loyalty, Hamish knew, could sometimes mask fear, or a desire to shield someone else. Had she seen something she shouldn't have, or perhaps carried a message for another? Then there was Hamish Sinclair, the butcher's son, whose eagerness to cooperate had struck Hamish as almost rehearsed. Sinclair had a temper, Hamish recalled, and the village gossip suggested he had long envied Mrs. MacLeod's influence over local affairs, small though they were. Ambition, he noted quietly, could drive even a normally harmless man to bold actions. The relatives who had arrived for Christmas complicated matters further. Cousins, nephews, distant nieces, all seemingly PBR. Light, yet all with plausible reasons to resent the elderly lady. Her modest inheritance, though not vast, was sufficient to spark jealousy or opportunism in those who had lived at her periphery for decades. Some had spoken of debts left unpaid, others of favours declined, and Hamish could see how, in their minds, a sudden end to Mrs. MacLeod's careful stewardship might have seemed perversely convenient. Yet none of the alibis were airtight, and none explained the peculiarity of the crime itself. The precision, the lack of forced entry, and the strange deliberate placement of the green owl on the mantel. Hamish's thoughts returned to the small details he had observed earlier. The tilted teacup, the faint smudge on the window, the scuff on the hallway floorboards, all signs of movement within a house that should have been empty overnight. Who had the skill to navigate the cottage so silently, so deliberately? Who could leave a message in the form of a hand-painted ornament, and yet make the act seem innocuous? Each clue seemed designed to point in a different direction, and Hamish realised that this was no ordinary crime of opportunity. Someone had planned this, and the planning reflected an intimate knowledge of the house and its occupant. That knowledge narrowed the field, but did not eliminate the multitude of potential suspects. He returned to the envelope he had found earlier in the kitchen, the cryptic message still weighing on him. Some truths are hidden where you least expect. It hinted at manipulation, a mind at work behind the apparent chaos. Hamish considered how each suspect might have interacted with Mrs. MacLeod in the days leading up to her death. Aylid, for example, had been entrusted with shopping and errands. Sinclair had perhaps delivered supplies or visited the cottage under the pretence of casual conversation. Even the relatives, polite and earned, had spent time inside, leaving the web of opportunity increasingly dense. The detective's mind began to visualize the overlaps, the times when each person had access, each chance they might have had to commit the act or influence the scene, and each subtle motive hiding beneath courteous words. Hamish's sharp eye caught a subtle contradiction he had not noticed before. Mrs. MacLeod had, according to Aylid, received all her usual deliveries the day before. Yet a package noted by one of the cousins was never accounted for in the room. The package's absence suggested either it had been deliberately removed, or someone had been in the house without acknowledging their presence. Either way, it implied planning, intention, and a motive carefully concealed beneath the surface of a seemingly innocent Christmas morning. Hamish considered the possibilities. Greed was obvious, but could there be a revenge element, an old grievance, perhaps a dispute over property, a perceived insult decades ago that had finally boiled over? Or might jealousy have played a part, some petty competition magnified by years of quiet resentment? He sat down on the edge of the armchair, letting the cold floor seep through his trousers, and ran through the suspects one by one. Each had opportunity, each had potential motive, yet no single theory explained everything. Hamish's mind worked systematically, separating what was provable from what was conjecture, yet leaving room for instinct. The small spark of intuition that had guided him through countless tangled cases. The house itself seemed to breathe, quiet but watchful, holding its secrets like the tiny green owl perched above the hearth. Hamish could feel that the threads of deception, like fragile filaments, were beginning to form a coherent pattern. Soon, he knew, the tangled maze of motives would start to unravel, revealing not just the culprit, but the reason why a peaceful village Christmas had been shattered in so deliberate and calculated a way. Hamish Macbeth had barely finished cataloguing the threads of motive when a sudden flurry of activity outside drew his attention. The constable, triumphant, had apparently found what he believed to be the breakthrough the village, and by extension the mainland authorities had been waiting for. Hamish stepped out into the snow, careful to keep his own observations to himself, as the young constable waved an envelope in the air and called for attention. "We found it!" the constable exclaimed, holding up a small leather pouch, a piece of jewellery belonging to Mrs. MacLeod, stolen from her house. The crowd murmured in awe. Hamish recognised the piece immediately, a delicate silver brooch in the shape of a thistle, one that Mrs. MacLeod had often worn pinned to her shawl. Its absence had not been noted initially, or perhaps it had been overlooked amid the more immediate shock of her death. The pouch had been discovered in the snow near the far edge of the property, half buried and marked by faint footprints. T.E. Constable, fueled by the excitement of his find, began rapidly linking the evidence to Hamish Sinclair, the butcher's son. It matches the reports of Sinclair's temper and his past disputes with Mrs. MacLeod. He had the opportunity, and now we have the object. The villagers nodded in agreement, eager for closure, and a sense of premature relief began to settle over the small crowd. Hamish, however, remained silent, his gaze flicking from the brooch to the surrounding snow, the footprints, and then to the cottage itself. Something didn't sit right. The object was real enough, yes, but its presence felt too convenient, almost deliberately placed to mislead. He knelt down to examine the tracks more closely. The snow showed evidence of deliberate disturbance, footprints leading in a circle, then fading back toward the house, as if someone had dropped the pouch in plain view and walked away casually, confident that its discovery would trigger exactly the response it had. He watched Sinclair's face as the constable approached him, accusation laced with certainty. The young man's cheeks were flushed with cold, his eyes wide, and his hands trembled slightly. Not the demeanour of someone who had committed such a meticulous crime, Hamish thought, but rather of someone caught in an unexpected storm of accusation. Sinclair protested his innocence, but the constable, emboldened by what seemed to be a tangible clue, refused to hear him. The villagers began to murmur again, some nodding, some frowning, suspicion and relief intertwining in a confusing mixture. Hamish, though outwardly calm, felt a tightening in his chest. The brooch was a brilliant piece of misdirection. It gave the appearance of resolution, but the inconsistencies he had already noted, the precision of the murder, the strange placement of the green owl, the subtle contradictions in witness statements, remained untouched. This was not the end of the puzzle. Whoever had planned the crime had orchestrated this too, ensuring that the first breakthrough would seem decisive, while the true perpetrator remained hidden, observing the chaos from the shadows. He rose and allowed himself to move closer to the cottage, pretending to examine the window smudge again, while he mentally replayed the day's discoveries. The envelope, the minor scuff on the floor, the faint traces of movement, all of these pointed to someone far more cunning than the constable realized. Hamish could almost feel the criminal's presence in the air, an invisible hand that had staged the scene to manipulate the perception of those who believed they understood what had happened. Even the villagers' reactions served as a distraction. Some were relieved, eager for closure, others hesitant, still sensing that the neat narrative being offered did not explain the oddities that had initially drawn Hamish's suspicion. He noted Ailid's posture once more. She had withdrawn slightly, watching Sinclair being questioned, her expression unreadable. If she knew more, she was hiding it. If she didn't, she instinctively recognized the false narrative taking shape before her eyes. Hamish stayed silent as the constable escorted Sinclair toward the village lockup, but his mind raced ahead, tracing the possible scenarios. The apparent solution was clever, yes, but superficial, a gloss over a deeper, more dangerous truth. He understood now that the real culprit was watching, waiting for the moment when the investigation would lower its guard, ready to act again if necessary, confident that the community would be distracted by the convenient scapegoat. As the snow fell softly over the quiet village, Hamish's eyes drifted back to the green owl on the mantel, its dark, glossy eyes reflecting the flicker of the dying fire. The ornament seemed to mock the premature victory, hinting at secrets still concealed, intentions still undiscovered. Hamish knew with a cold certainty that the case was far from closed, and that the murderer, invisible in plain sight, was still at large, weaving the next chapter of plan that only he could unravel. Hamish Macbeth lingered outside Mrs. MacLeod's cottage, watching the snow drift lazily onto the rooftops and the village's narrow streets. The festive morning had shifted into a tense, uneasy quiet. The constable's premature declaration of a solved case had left a hollow sense of closure among the villagers, but for Hamish, unease gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. He retraced the evidence in his mind, the subtle clues that refused to fit neatly into the narrative everyone had accepted. Then, as he paced the path near the low stone wall, something struck him. A fleeting memory from years ago, a case so minor it had almost been forgotten, but one that had rattled the village in ways similar to this. Tea had involved Mrs. MacLeod herself, though Hamish had not made the connection until now. A burglary, minor in scale, had occurred nearly a decade ago, in which an outsider had entered the village under the guise of visiting relatives. The case had never been solved, and the stolen items were never recovered. But the memory of that investigation resurfaced with startling clarity. Certain individuals had been implicated, rumours whispered but never confirmed, and the subtle tensions that lingered had never truly dissipated. Hamish realised now that the patterns of resentment, the grudges, and the subtle rivalries that had persisted under the surface could very well connect directly to the current crime. Returned to the cottage, slipping inside where the fire still smouldered in the hearth, its warmth juxtaposed against the chill of the mystery. His eyes drifted to the mantel, the green owl seemingly more purposeful than ever, a silent witness to both present and past. Crouched, examining the area around the ornament once more, and it was then he noticed something previously overlooked. Faint scratches along the underside of the shell bar. F, almost imperceptible unless one was deliberately searching. He traced the pattern with a gloved finger, realizing that these were not random. They aligned with the positioning of other objects, a hidden map of sorts, or at least a message intended for someone with intimate knowledge of the house's layout. As he studied the scratches, the web of connections between the current suspects began to crystallize. Aelid Mackenzie's family had been involved peripherally in that earlier burglary, their loyalties divided between neighbourly allegiance and long-standing suspicion. Sinclair's family, too, had been mentioned in hushed tones, a rivalry over the village butcher's trade intersecting with the gossip that had coloured Mrs. MacLeod's interactions with them. Even some of the distant relatives had been connected to that old case in minor but meaningful ways. Debts unpaid, favours called in, and the occasional bitter disagreement remembered far longer than it should have been. Suddenly, the modern-day crime was no longer a standalone act of greed or impulse. It was the culmination of grudges long simmering, resentments, and carefully nurtured opportunities that had matured over years. And Mish felt the familiar thrill of revelation tinged with caution. The old case had been forgotten by everyone else, but its echoes had shaped the behaviour of the villagers in subtle ways. Those whispers, those half-truths, those grudges kept alive in polite conversation. He now understood that they were far from harmless. They were part of a matrix that had enabled the current crime, offering both motive and method to the perpetrator who had carefully orchestrated the murder and the subsequent misdirection. H rose, brushing the snow from his coat once more, and began cross-referencing timelines in his mind. The movements of Aelid, Sinclair, and the relatives now made more sense in this new Cobalt bar. Each interaction, each visit, each small act of seeming normalcy could be traced back to that single forgotten incident, a seed planted years before that had now borne a deadly fruit. Hamish realized that the murderer had relied not only on opportunity and greed, but on historical knowledge, on secrets buried deep enough that no one would have expected them to be relevant again. Hamish's eyes returned to the envelope he had found in the kitchen, the cryptic message still echoing in his mind. Some truths are hidden where you least expect. The truths were indeed hidden, not just in the physical space of the house, but in the collective memory of the village, the unseen connections and old grievances that no one had thought to question. He could sense, now more strongly than ever, that the path to solving the murder lay not merely in examining the present, but in untangling the strands of the past, revealing the ways in which old resentments had been manipulated to create the perfect opportunity for a calculated act. As the snow continued to fall outside, Hamish felt the weight of the task ahead. He understood that to uncover the murderer, he would need to trace every old slight, every unspoken resentment, every quiet moment of tension that had been ignored for too long. The shadows of the past were long, but Hamish knew that if he followed them carefully step by step, they would illuminate the path to the truth hidden in plain sight, waiting to be revealed. Hamish Macbeth sat quietly in the cottage, letting the warmth of the smouldering fire seep into his bones as he weighed the tangled web of motives and historical grudges. He knew that conventional questioning had already been exhausted. Villagers were cautious, rehearsed in their statements, and any straightforward interrogation would likely yield little more than rehearsed denials or half-truths. He needed something unconventional, something that would provoke a response revealing more than words alone could. His mind lingered on the green owl, the envelope, the faint scratches, and the seemingly random placement of objects that had so far escaped attention. He called Aelid Mackenzie aside, under the pretense of reviewing her recollections from the previous night. suggesting he needed help to make sense of the decorations and where they were placed. Her eyes brightened slightly. She seemed eager to cooperate, or at least to appear cooperative. Hamish watched her carefully, his gaze casual, almost distracted, as he gestured to the mantel. "This owl," he said softly. "It's peculiar, isn't it? I wonder why Mrs. MacLeod left it here, untouched. Perhaps it was meant as a signal or a reminder." He let his words hang in the air, leaving no immediate question, only suggestion. Lid's eyes flicked to the ornament, then to Hamish, her hands tightening on the hem of her scarf. Hamish allowed a moment of silence, letting the tension settle in the room. Then he continued, speaking almost to himself. "You see, sometimes people leave things exactly where they shouldn't be, expecting someone to notice or to overlook. It's a curious way to communicate, isn't it?" He watched her reaction closely, noting the subtle twitch of her lips, the way she swallowed, the slight backward tilt of her head. It was almost imperceptible, but Hamish had long learned that the smallest gestures often spoke volumes. "I've been around Mrs. MacLeod a long time," he said quietly, leaning back slightly. "You notice details most people don't. Did anything unusual happen yesterday? Anything that seemed out of place?" Aelid's hands fidgeted now, fingers twisting the scarf nervously. She hesitated, then shook her head, eyes wide. "No. Nothing, Hamish. Really. Her voice was steady, but her body betrayed a tension that seemed too pronounced for casual fear. Hamish let the silence stretch again, pressing gently without demanding an answer. "What if," he said thoughtfully, "someone wanted you to notice something, to understand something, without ever speaking of it aloud? Imagine, for a moment, that the ornaments, the objects, even the envelope you found, were part of a story only you were meant to read. How would you react?" The question was indirect, almost philosophical, but the effect was immediate. Aelid froze, her eyes darting to the mantel, then to the envelope, then back to Hamish. She bit her lip, a faint tremor passing through her hand, and for the first time Hamish saw the flicker of recognition, the subtle crack in the careful mask of composure she had maintained. Hamish allowed a small smile to touch his lips. He didn't need words. The reaction was enough. The tension in her posture, the slight flush in her cheeks, the almost imperceptible hesitation in breathing, these were the signals he had been waiting for. The girl knew more than she had revealed, and the unconventional tactic had unearthed it. A direct question might have been ignored, a casual query brushed aside, but by appealing to her intuition, her perception, and her relationship with Mrs. MacLeod, Hamish had bypassed the defences she had built around herself. He let the moment linger, observing her struggle between instinct and loyalty. "You're very perceptive, Aelid," he said softly. "Perhaps more than you realize. It's not always what people say, but what they notice, and what they try to hide, that tells the real story." The girl's lips parted slightly, almost as if she were about to speak, yet Hamish remained silent, letting her reach the decision herself. The pause, pregnant with possibility, seemed to stretch for a heartbeat too long before she finally exhaled, the tension ebbing just enough to allow a whisper of truth to escape. Hamish knew, with the quiet certainty that had guided him through countless tangled cases, that this was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. Not a physical clue, but a psychological one. Aelid's subtle reaction had revealed a connection between her, Mrs. MacLeod, and the circumstances of the murder that no other interrogative method could have elicited. The real criminal remained hidden, but the cracks in the carefully constructed facade were appearing, and with patience and observation Hamish could now begin to follow them toward the heart of the deception that had transformed a quiet Christmas morning into a deadly puzzle. Hamish Macbeth was just beginning to piece together the subtle revelations from Aelid's reaction when a sudden commotion from the back of the cottage drew his attention. The constable, still caught up in the euphoria of what he believed to be the solved case, was waving frantically toward the kitchen. Hamish moved swiftly, his mind already anticipating the worst. The envelope, the one with the cryptic message, was gone. In its place lay only a faint smear where the paper had rested. Hamish's eyes narrowed. The message had been carefully removed, and the paper itself deliberately destroyed or taken. Whoever had done it knew its significance, knew that Hamish had discovered its value, and had acted to erase it before he could extract further meaning. It was not carelessness, it was deliberate interference, a shadowy hand reaching to bury the truth. The constable looked flustered, stammering explanations about the envelope maybe falling behind the counter or perhaps blown away by the wind. Hamish didn't respond. He knew better. The wind did not carry envelopes inside a closed kitchen, and the careless phrasing of the excuses only confirmed his suspicion. Espiar bar. O'Mona within the cottage, or nearby, had removed it intentionally. His mind raced, retracing every movement in the house over the past hours, considering every suspect who had both motive and opportunity. He glanced at Aelid, who had stepped back toward the doorway, hands trembling slightly. Her eyes flickered to the empty space where the envelope had rested, and Hamish caught the briefest shadow of panic. He made a mental note. She might know more than she had yet revealed, and the disappearance of the envelope could either implicate her or indicate that someone else was working with precision and foresight. Hamish crouched near the counter, studying the faint marks left behind. A small smudge of green paint, barely noticeable, matched the base of the hand-painted owl on the mantel. Someone had handled the envelope and the objects nearby with deliberate care, leaving only the smallest trace, as though daring the detective to notice. Hamish's pulse quickened, not from fear but from anticipation. The vanishing of evidence was a challenge, a signal that the perpetrator was not finished, that the careful orchestration of the crime extended beyond the murder itself and into the manipulation of the investigation. The detective's gaze shifted to the faint footprints in the snow just outside the kitchen window. They were subtle, partially erased, as if someone had deliberately retraced their steps, trying to confuse the direction of movement. Hamish crouched, examining the impressions carefully. There was a rhythm to the footfalls, the pause of a person checking behind them, the careful alignment to avoid leaving full prints. Whoever had taken the envelope was cautious, methodical, and intimately familiar with the cottage's layout. The evidence was not merely removed. It had been extracted and manipulated with a precision that suggested confidence and experience. Hamish stray. Tend slowly, letting the constable fumble around him while he considered the implications. The vanishing evidence changed everything. The premature solution, the scapegoat Sinclair, suddenly appeared even more tenuous. The murderer, or an accomplice, was still active, watching the investigation and taking steps to control what would be revealed. Trust had become a fragile thing. Every witness, every familiar face, had to be measured against the possibility of concealment or deception. He turned his attention back to Aelid, her earlier nervousness now compounded by the sudden disappearance. Hamish's instincts told him she had either been involved in the removal, or at the very least had knowledge of who had been. The subtle cues, the twitches, the hesitation in her eyes, all suggested a mind wrestling with the fear of exposure, and the instinct to protect someone or something. Hamish decided he would need to apply the same careful, psychological approach that had earlier revealed her unconscious reaction, probing gently, observing even more minutely. The snow outside continued to fall, soft and deceptive, blanketing the village in a serene white that belied the danger that lingered within the cottage walls. Hamish felt the tension coiling, tight and alive, as he considered the possibilities. The vanishing envelope was more than just a lost clue, it was a statement. The murderer was not finished, and the careful orchestration of deception was ongoing. Hamish's task had just grown far more complex. Every step forward now required patience, precision, and the sharpest observation, because the true criminal was hiding in plain sight, manipulating events from the shadows, and ready to strike again if given the chance. Hamish Macbeth had barely begun to reassess the remaining pieces of the puzzle when a sudden, sharp cry rang out from the far side of the village. Instincti. Veely dropped to one knee in the snow, eyes scanning the rooftops and streets. The villagers scattered, panic replacing the fragile relief that had settled over them after Sinclair's arrest. Hamish's heart tightened. The sound was not distant rumour or superstition. It was real, immediate, and unmistakably a call for help. He sprinted toward the source, Aelid hurrying beside him. her earlier hesitation replaced with urgent energy. As they rounded the corner near the frozen river, the scene that greeted them was chilling. Hamish Sinclair, the young man who had been so hastily taken into custody, now lay sprawled in the snow, unconscious, a deep gash across his forehead where a hidden rock had struck him. Beside him, the pouch containing the silver brooch, once considered the cornerstone of the solved case, was smashed and scattered, tiny fragments of metal glittering in the pale morning light. Someone had deliberately targeted Sinclair, ensuring the evidence was destroyed, and sending a message that the real power behind these crimes remained unseen and untouchable. Hamish knelt beside Sinclair, checking for signs of life and noting the calculated cruelty of the act. The attack was precise, not random, but designed to intimidate, to demonstrate control over the investigation itself. He could see immediately that the perpetrator had been watching, predicting the constable's rush to judgment, and moving several steps ahead to manipulate the outcome. Whoever this was, they were clever, patient, and ruthless, and the consequences of underestimating them were now starkly evident. Aelide, her face pale and lips pressed tightly together, whispered, It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Hamish's eyes met hers, reading the subtle tremor in her voice, the tension that suggested she knew more than she had yet admitted. "Then tell me what you do know," he said quietly. "Here's to—" Low but firm. She shook her head, but Hamish noted the micro-expression, an almost imperceptible twitch of her brow, that hinted at fear, not deception. He could feel the careful facade beginning to crack, as if the unfolding chaos were forcing the truth closer to the surface. Hamish rose, scanning the perimeter. The snow was thick, but the footprints were telling. Someone had approached Sinclair from the shadowed edge of the riverbank, moving quickly, with deliberate steps to avoid detection. Hamish traced the prints back toward the village, and noted something chilling. The footprints looped around, suggesting the assailant had circled, observing, waiting for the right moment to strike, then vanished without leaving the trace of a final escape. The message was clear. The murderer had the advantage, and the village, and the constable's prematurely confident solution were all part of a carefully staged tableau. Hamish knew the investigation had shifted. This was no longer simply about uncovering the murderer of Mrs. MacLeod. It was about preventing the next calculated act, identifying the criminal who remained several steps ahead, and protecting those still vulnerable in the small, snow-bound village. The stakes had risen sharply. Every clue, every hesitation, every subtle gesture could be critical in anticipating the next move. He glanced at the broken brooch glinting faintly in the snow, fragments that were now almost useless, as evidence, but potent as a symbol. The criminal had ensured that Sinclair, the convenient scapegoat, was no longer capable of misleading the investigation. But the act also served as a warning to anyone watching too closely. Hamish's mind raced, piecing together the implications. The attacker had intimate knowledge of the village, the routines of its inhabitants, and the trajectory of the investigation itself. Hamish looked up at Aelide once more, her fear now mingled with a glimmer of determination. He sensed that she could be key to revealing the next step, but only if he could navigate the delicate balance between coaxing information and maintaining her trust. The snow continued to fall, cold and unrelenting, blanketing the village in deceptive serenity. But Hamish knew that beneath its quiet, the danger was very real, immediate, and calculated. The investigation had taken a sharp turn, and the detective realized that solving one crime would not be enough. He now had to anticipate a second, prevent further tragedy, and finally confront the cunning mind that had orchestrated so much chaos from the shadows. Hamish Macbeth stood in the snow beside Sinclair, the broken brooch scattered like tiny shards of silver around them, the winter air biting at his cheeks. He let the constable fuss over the injured man, keeping his focus trained on the footprints, the traces of movement, the subtle cues that the criminal had left behind. Amid the chaos of the attack, Hamish's mind began to sift through every observation, every micro-detail he had collected over the past day. Patterns, he knew, often revealed themselves not in the grand gestures, but in the minutiae that most would dismiss. He returned to the cottage once Sinclair had been taken for medical attention, stepping carefully over the trampled snow that now bore the imprint of the morning's confusion. Inside, the small green owl on the mantel seemed to watch him with its dark, glossy eyes. Hamish crouched, examining the scratches at its base again, tracing the subtle lines with his gloved fingers, and then it clicked. A seemingly insignificant detail, dismissed earlier, now began to make sense. The faint trace of green paint on the kitchen counter, the tiny scuff on the hallway floorboards, and, most importantly, the precise way Eileid had reacted to the mention of the owl. It wasn't just the owl itself, it was the way it had been moved, handled, and placed in the context of the room. Hamish realised that the pattern of placement, the subtle traces of handling, and the timing of the reactions all pointed to a single, deliberate sequence. Each action, no matter how small or inconsequential it had seemed at the time, formed a chain leading directly to the perpetrator. The scratches weren't random. They indicated that someone had been deliberately checking or aligning the objects, leaving a coded map of intentions for those observant enough to see. Hamish's eyes drifted to the mantel, then to the floor. The green paint, smudge, barely visible, matched the colour of the owl exactly, and its location suggested that the envelope, now vanished, had once rested there. It was no coincidence that Eileid had reacted the way she had. She had seen or handled something she shouldn't have, and the criminal had relied on that reaction to manipulate the investigation. Suddenly, the pieces of Eileid's body language, the subtle tension in her hands, the hesitation in her voice, all coalesced into a clear indicator. She was key to understanding how the murderer had operated. Hamish leaned back, scanning the room as if seeing it anew. The tiny, seemingly insignificant details, the offhand remarks from villagers, the unusual handling of objects, the small gestures of attention or avoidance were not random. Each was part of a deliberate pattern, a psychological map the murderer had unknowingly, or perhaps intentionally, left behind. Even the vanishing envelope now had a place in the sequence. It had been removed not to hide its contents entirely, but to force a reaction, to test who among the villagers noticed and who could be manipulated. He paused, recalling the old, forgotten burglary case, and the lingering tensions it had left behind. Now the connections were clear. The criminal had used long-standing grudges and knowledge of the village's history to predict behaviour, to anticipate reactions, and to orchestrate both the murder and the subsequent misdirection. Every misstep, every overreaction, every hesitated glance had been part of the plan, but the pattern had been visible all along to someone patient and observant. Hamish felt a thrill of recognition as he connected one final thread. The green owl, the envelope, the subtle scratches, Eileid's reactions, even the timing of Sinclair's attack, they all pointed to a calculated strategy that had been executed with precision. The murderer had relied on what they assumed was invisibility, yet the very details they believed insignificant were the markers that would ultimately reveal them. The pattern emerged with stark clarity. The crime was not only premeditated, but choreographed, and its solution had been in plain sight all along, obscured only by the chaos of everyday assumptions and the villagers' eagerness to accept easy answers. Hamish straightened, letting the weight of the realization settle. The investigation was no longer a matter of piecing together disparate clues. It was about following the sequence laid out in the criminal's own hand, subtle and deliberate, to uncover the person who had manipulated both the crime scene and the investigation itself. For the first time he felt the unmistakable pulse of certainty. The path to the truth had been revealed through a pattern so carefully concealed that it had almost escaped notice entirely. And now, with that pattern clear, Hamish knew the next steps could be decisive, drawing him closer to unmasking the mastermind who had turned a quiet Christmas morning into a deadly, calculated tableau. Hamish Macbeth sat quietly in the sitting room, letting the realization of the pattern settle into his mind like a snowdrift accumulating silently over the village rooftops. The broken brooch, the vanished envelope, the green owl, Eileid's subtle reactions, all of it had been leading to a truth far more intricate than a simple act of greed or jealousy. He knew now that the next step was not merely to watch for missteps, but to confront the underlying psychology that had driven someone to orchestrate such a complex and chilling series of events. He began to retrace the movements of the suspects, allowing the past interactions, glances, and half-spoken words to align with the emerging pattern. Slowly, the pieces clicked into place. Sinclair's eagerness to cooperate, Aelid's nerveux, hesitations, the relatives' polite inconsistencies, they were all components in a much larger design. And the centerpiece, Hamish realized, was not money, nor petty revenge. It was control. The murderer had needed to dominate the narrative, to manipulate not just events, but the perceptions and emotions of everyone involved. Hamish's mind went back to the subtle details, the owl placed deliberately on the mantel, the envelope meant to provoke a reaction, the careful timing of Sinclair's attack. Each move had been calculated to exert power, to watch the chaos unfold like a carefully staged play. The criminal had sought more than concealment. They craved observation, an intimate sense of triumph in orchestrating fear, confusion, and misdirection. The crime, Hamish understood, was not just a means to an end, it was the end in itself, a demonstration of the murderer's own sense of superiority and control over life, death, and the fragile bonds of trust. He turned his attention to the old grudges, the forgotten burglary, the hidden tensions still lingering in the village. The murderer had exploited these historical resentments, weaving them into the present with deliberate precision. Each subtle slight, each unspoken feud had become a tool, a lever to manipulate emotions and expectations. Hamish's gaze lingered on Aelid. She was deeply connected to the unfolding events, not by motive alone, but by proximity, by knowledge, and perhaps by unwitting involvement in the criminal's psychological game. Then it struck him. The audacity of the plan, the orchestration of every clue and every reaction, revealed the true motive. The murderer had sought recognition, a sense of omnipotence over others' perceptions, to demonstrate that they could outwit not just a single observer but an entire community. The crime was art in its own twisted way, a meticulously choreographed sequence tended to draw attention, provoke panic, and measure responses. It was not enough for the murderer that Mrs. MacLeod was dead. They had to engineer the investigation, control the narrative, and force the village, and Hamish himself, into the web they had spun. Hamish reflected on the signs he had seen all along, the vanishing envelope, the subtle scratches, the green paint smudge, Aelid's reactions, the timing of Sinclair's assault. Each had been designed to test the limits of perception, to gauge how far their manipulations could stretch before being detected. The murderer's psychology was laid bare in these moves, a compulsive need for control, a fascination with fear, and a relentless desire to manipulate both the innocent and the complicit alike. The detective's eyes swept the room again, lingering on the owl, its black eyes seemingly more accusatory now than ever. Hamish felt a shiver run down his spine, but it was tempered by clarity. He understood the depths of calculation involved, the lengths to which the murderer had gone not merely to commit the crime, but to orchestrate it as an elaborate demonstration of power. It explained the precision, the misdirection, the carefully timed interventions that had kept Sinclair in the crosshairs, provoked Aelid's reactions, and maintained an illusion of control over the investigation. Hamish finally stood, resolving to confront the final piece of the puzzle. The hidden motive, the dark psychological engine driving the criminal's actions, was now clear. It was not about inheritance, or petty resentment, or even revenge. It was about dominance, observation, and the intoxicating thrill of being several steps ahead of everyone, shaping events like a puppeteer. Understanding that motive gave Hamish a decisive advantage, knowing the criminal craved recognition, he could anticipate the next move, exploit the need for control, de-force the unseen hand into revealing itself. The village outside remained deceptively peaceful, snow covering the streets in pristine white, but inside, Hamish's mind raced. The criminal's game was intricate, dangerous, and far from over. Yet now, armed with the understanding of the hidden motive, the psychological obsession driving every careful, cruel step, Hamish felt the first true surge of hope. He could see the path forward, and for the first time, the shadows that had loomed over Lochtoo's Christmas morning seemed negotiable, their edges faintly illuminated by the clarity of insight. Hamish Macbeth stood at the edge of the village green, the snow crunching beneath his boots, and watched the familiar rooftops with a mind sharpened by days of observation, deduction, and cautious anticipation. He had laid the groundwork carefully, threading together the fragments of the past and present, the green owl, the vanished envelope, Sinclair's attack, Ailid's reactions, the hidden grudges, and the psychological pattern of control. Everything now pointed to one inescapable conclusion. The murderer could be forced into action if the trap was set with precision. He had decided on a subtle approach, one that relied on the criminal's own compulsions against them. Word had been allowed to spread, carefully, subtly, that a new clue had been discovered, one that would definitively reveal the true perpetrator. The suggestion of exposure, combined with the murderer's insatiable need for control and recognition, would force them to act, and Hamish intended to be ready when they did. He arranged for Ailid to remain in the cottage under the pretext of further questioning, knowing she could help him observe reactions without alerting the murderer. Hamish's eyes swept the village paths and narrow lanes, attuned to the smallest flicker of movement, the slightest hesitation in a passer-by. Gate! Hours passed slowly, the winter sun barely rising above the hills, until Hamish noticed a shadow flit along the edge of the village, moving with the quiet deliberation of someone confident in their invisibility. He remained still, letting the observer draw near the cottage. A figure appeared in the snow, cautious, scanning the windows as if ensuring the scene inside remained undisturbed. Hamish allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to touch his lips. The trap had worked exactly as intended. The murderer could not resist the pull of the unfolding drama. The need to intervene, to control, to assert dominance, had lured them into position. Hamish stepped forward calmly as the figure approached the front door. "I wondered when you'd show up," he said in a low, steady voice, careful not to betray either surprise or tension. The shadow froze, then slowly turned, revealing a face familiar to the village, yet so often overlooked in the midst of petty resentments and everyday interactions. The murderer's eyes, wide with the sudden recognition of being cornered, flicked between Hamish, the cottage, and the snow-covered ground. A subtle tremor passed through their fingers, betraying the composure they had so carefully cultivated. "You think you can manipulate the entire village, and even me," Hamish continued, his voice calm but edged with quiet authority. "Every detail, every reaction, every little discrepancy, it all led here. You didn't just plan the murder, you planned the chaos, the misdirection, the fear, and yet you left the pattern in plain sight." The figure's lips tightened, a flicker of panic crossing the mask of control. For the first time they faltered, and Hamish knew that the psychological pressure had begun to work. I didn't mean for anyone to," the murderer stammered, their carefully constructed confidence unravelling under the weight of exposure. Hamish's eyes were unyielding, drawing the confession forward with the same quiet inevitability he had observed in Ailid's earlier reactions. The murderer's hands twitched toward the pocket where the green owl had been touched earlier, an instinctive move to assert control, to remove a perceived threat. Hamish anticipated it, stepping forward with a swift, precise motion to intercept. The figure froze, realizing their options had narrowed to a cornered choice: submission or a desperate, reckless escape. Finally, the truth poured out, a torrent of confessions revealing not just the mechanics of the crime, but the psychological obsession that had driven every move. The murder of Mrs. Mac Leod, the manipulation of Sinclair, the careful orchestration of clues and reactions, all had been designed to assert dominance, to test perceptions, to create a spectacle of control that satisfied a deep and dangerous compulsion. Hamish listened without interruption, letting the words reveal the depths of planning, the meticulous attention to detail, and the astonishing audacity of the criminal's mind. The confession subsided, the figure slumped, exhausted, defeated not by force but by the inevitability of exposure. Hamish's composure never wavered. He had known all along that the murderer's own psychology would be their undoing. With quiet precision, he guided them toward the constable waiting in the snow outside. The trap had worked perfectly, the murderer had revealed themselves, the evidence was secured, and the village of Lochdu, once ensnared in chaos and fear, could finally begin to breathe again. Hamish stepped back into the quiet of the cottage, surveying the remnants of the puzzle: broken brooches, smudged paint, the green owl watching silently. The case was resolved, not through brute force or hurried accusation, but through patience, observation, and understanding the Berber, intricate patterns of human behaviour. And as the snow continued to drift down in gentle silence, Hamish Macbeth allowed himself a rare, small smile. Christmas morning had been ruined, yes, but the truth had prevailed, and justice, subtle, precise, and inevitable, had finally been restored. Hamish Macbeth had escorted the confessed murderer toward the waiting constable, the chill of the snow biting through his coat, but he felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. The pieces had fallen into place, the pattern understood, the hidden motive exposed, and the villain caught. For the first time since that fateful Christmas morning, a sense of closure seemed within reach for Lochdu. He allowed himself a brief pause outside the cottage, letting the winter sun glint off the rooftops, when a sudden flicker of movement near the window caught his attention. He froze, eyes narrowing, and glanced toward the green owl still perched on the mantel. It wasn't the ornament itself that concerned him, but the shadow behind it, a faint reflection, a glint of something metallic in the snow outside, something he had overlooked. Hamish's instincts, honed over years of observing human behaviour and the smallest details, screamed that the story was not yet over. He silently urged the constable to hold the prisoner and move toward the window, careful to keep his movements deliberate and unobtrusive. Outside, partially hidden in the falling snow, a figure crouched behind a low stone wall, watching. The presence was deliberate, cautious, and yet brimming with a confidence that suggested intimate knowledge of the investigation, someone who had been orchestrating events from the shadows even while the confessed murderer was in custody. Hamish's mind raced, replaying every interaction, every minor anomaly he had noted over the past hours. The subtle cues, the hesitations, the slight inconsistencies in statements, all pointed to a truth he had not yet confronted. The individual who had confessed was a tool, a pawn, in a more intricate game. Hamish stepped outside, deliberately casual, and called toward the figure. "I think it's time we had a word, don't you?" The shadow shifted, retreating slightly, and then froze as Hamish's voice carried the unmistakable calm authority of someone who had already calculated their next move. Slowly, the figure emerged, revealing a face no one had suspected. Not Sinclair, not Aelid, not any of the relatives who had seemed entwined in the chain of events. It was someone quieter, someone who had been present at the edges, blending into the village life so seamlessly that their involvement had seemed impossible. The long-time village librarian, Mrs. Macpherson, known for her quiet demeanour, her meticulous record-keeping, and her apparent disinterest in the daily dramas of Lochdubre. Hamish's eyes locked on hers. "You've been orchestrating everything," he said quietly, letting the accusation hang in the snow-chilled air. "The murder, the misdirection, the patterns, even the removal of the envelope. It wasn't just the confessed murderer acting alone, was it?" Her lips twitched, a flicker of defiance mingled with the first hint of panic, but Hamish remained composed. R.S. Macpherson's hands moved almost imperceptibly toward the satchel at her side, and Hamish's eyes followed the motion, noting the subtle rhythm, the way her posture suggested readiness to flee or to destroy yet more evidence. "You underestimated what I could see," Hamish said softly. "You thought the small details wouldn't matter, that no one would notice your manipulations behind the scenes. But the pattern was always there. Bar T. Librarian's calm mask cracked just enough for Hamish to see the truth, a careful, obsessive drive for control that had extended far beyond the immediate B. She had used Sinclair as a pawn, manipulated Aelid's reactions, and played the villagers' trust and fears like instruments in her symphony of deception. Her motive, while grounded in a desire for dominance, also had a personal edge. Years of quiet resentment at being overlooked, underestimated, and ignored within the community she had served for decades. The crime had been her way of proving superiority, to orchestrate events that no one else could predict, and to force recognition of her intelligence, cunning, and foresight. Hamish allowed a thin smile to touch his lips, though the cold bit at his cheeks. "It ends here, Mrs. Macpherson," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "The pattern is revealed, the game is exposed, and there's nowhere left to hide." She hesitated, eyes flicking to the cottage, to the snow, to the villagers who had gathered at a distance, drawn by the unfolding drama, before finally lowering her hands, a faint sigh escaping her lips, the final concession to inevitability. In that moment, the last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The confessed murderer had been a calculated diversion, a controlled release to mislead and manipulate, while the true mastermind had orchestrated the entire sequence of events with patience and precision. Hamish felt a quiet surge of triumph, tempered by the awareness that even in a village as small as Lochdu, appearances could deceive, and the cleverest minds could hide in plain sight. As the constable moved to secure Mrs. Macpherson, Hamish allowed himself a rare, almost private moment of satisfaction. The final twist had been revealed, the web of deceit unravelled, and the truth, as complex and chilling as it had been, was finally clear. Snow had begun to settle into soft drifts around Lochdu, painting the village in the deceptive calm of winter's quiet. Hamish Macbeth watched as the constable Esquire ordered Mrs. Macpherson toward the waiting police carriage, her movements restrained, her head held high, but the simmering tension in her eyes, betraying the inner storm she had carried throughout the days of careful manipulation. The villagers lingered at the edges of the green, some whispering in disbelief, others casting glances that mixed relief with lingering suspicion. Hamish's gaze, however, was fixed on the subtler details, the quiet spaces where the criminal's influence had passed unnoticed, the footprints in the snow that no one had thought to follow, the smudges and scratches that had formed the trail leading him to the true mastermind. He allowed himself a deep breath, letting the chill air sharpen his thoughts, and then began to trace the sequence out loud, as if narrating to the silent witnesses around him. It started with a murder so perfectly staged that the evidence pointed everywhere but at the real culprit. The envelope, now gone, was meant to provoke reactions, to test perception, and it worked exactly as intended. The owl, the placement of ornaments, even the tiniest smudge of paint, it all formed a pattern. Hamish's eyes scanned the villagers' faces, noting the faint recognition dawning on some, the disbelief lingering in others. Every small clue was overlooked because it seemed insignificant. The scratches on the mantel, the faint footprints circling the cottage, the way Sinclair reacted to pressure, they were all signals, hidden in plain sight. E paused, letting the words settle, and then continued explaining the subtle psychological maneuvers that had ensnared even the most vigilant. The confessed murderer, a convenient scapegoat, was merely a pawn. They acted as directed, manipulated into fulfilling a role that diverted suspicion, while the real mastermind orchestrated events from the shadows. The attack on Sinclair, the stolen evidence, the bar. Careful timing. All of it was calculated, designed to control perception, to create fear, and to measure responses. And the true villain, hidden in plain sight, relied on the knowledge of history, human behavior, and village habits to stay one step ahead. Aelid, standing near the doorway, finally exhaled in relief, though her gaze flickered toward Mrs. Macpherson with lingering unease. Hamish glanced at her, giving a faint nod, acknowledging her unwitting involvement in the chain of events and the subtle courage she had shown in revealing what she did. Then he shifted back to the scene, scanning the cottage one last time, allowing the warmth of insight to settle around him. Every movement, every hesitation, every overlooked object had been a thread, and now they had been woven into a tapestry, revealing the full picture of deception, ambition, and obsession. Eat. As Hamish observed the departing carriage and the constable guiding Mrs. Macpherson into custody, a nagging sense of incompleteness tugged at him. The librarian had been caught, But the shadows she had manipulated, the psychological games she had set in motion, would leave lingering echoes in the village for months to come. Trust had been fractured, and even as justice appeared to be served, the subtle scars of fear, doubt, and manipulation could not be fully erased. Hamish knew that in a village so small, the story would not end neatly. The memory of the crime, the thrill of the deception, and the quiet brilliance of the criminal's planning would continue to ripple through Loch Dhu long after the snow had melted. Mish turned back to the cottage's interior, his gaze lingering on the mantel where the green owl had sat. "You see," he murmured more to himself than anyone else, "the criminal relied on what everyone considered inconsequential, the tiny details that go unnoticed, the reactions that go unexamined. Teach bar bar. That is why it is so rarely solved without a careful eye, patience, and understanding of the human mind." He ran a finger over the faint scratches one last time. The map of manipulation that had been hidden there all along. The pattern was never lost. It was simply invisible to those who did not know where or how to look. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the village green, Hamish allowed himself a moment of satisfaction tempered by vigilance. Justice had been delivered in the legal sense, yet the echoes of the criminal mind, the psychological intricacies, and the skillful orchestration remained as a reminder. In Loch Dhu, even on the quietest of Christmas mornings, nothing is ever as simple as it seems. And Hamish, as always, would remain one step ahead, watching, observing, and ready for the next shadow that might cross his path. Hamish Macbeth stepped away from the cottage, the snow crunching underfoot, and drew a deep breath of the crisp winter air. The village had begun to settle back into its usual rhythm. The villagers, though still murmuring in hushed tones, were returning to their chores, their shopping, and the small routines that gave Loch Dhu its familiar rhythm. Yet Hamish's mind, restless as ever, lingered on the case's remaining subtleties. Every puzzle had been solved, or so it seemed, but instinct, honed over countless cases, whispered that not every question had been answered. As he moved down the lane, he glanced back at the cottage. The green owl, now alone on the mantel, caught the fading light of the afternoon sun, and for a moment it seemed to peer at him knowingly. Hamish's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. The owl had played its part in the unravelling of the mystery, but its subtle placement, its peculiar design, and the almost imperceptible scratches at its base still gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the thought that someone, perhaps the mastermind or another shadowy figure, had left one final clue, a small signature of their handiwork meant to go unnoticed. A soft wind stirred the snow at his feet, and Hamish noticed a tiny piece of folded paper tucked into a crevice along the garden wall. Carefully he bent to retrieve it, mindful not to distew. R&B, any other traces. The paper was small, almost insignificant, and yet the handwriting was deliberate, tight, precise, unusually careful. Unfolding it, he found a single line written in ink so faint it was almost invisible. "Observe beyond what is seen." No name, no date, nothing else. Just a cryptic reminder, a whisper of warning, and an invitation to question what had been considered complete. Hamish's lips pressed together, a faint smile touching his face. The note confirmed what he had long suspected. The mastermind's reach may extend further than even the carefully orchestrated events of this Christmas morning. There might be accomplices, overlooked details, or intentions yet unseen. Perhaps the criminal had underestimated him, leaving this subtle message as both challenge and signature. Hamish tucked the note into his coat pocket, the weight of possibility heavy yet invigorating. The case of Mrs. MacLeod's murder was officially closed, the true villain apprehended, but the thread of uncertainty, deliberately planted, or accidentally revealed, remained, like a faint echo of a bell in the distance. He continued down the snow-covered street, noting the way the shadows shifted as the sun dipped behind the hills, aware of the villagers' eyes following him, some with gratitude, some with lingering unease. Hamish's steps were deliberate but relaxed, his mind already cataloguing every nuance of the day. The psychological manipulation, the vanished evidence, the reactions and missteps, and now the cryptic note that hinted at more. Each detail, though seemingly minor, could be the seed of another investigation, a new puzzle waiting for the sharp eye and patient mind of Lochdu's quiet detective. He reached the edge of the village, the familiar silhouette of the hills ahead. Hamish paused. He looked back at the cottages, the snow glinting faintly, and allowed himself a rare, thoughtful moment. The village was safe, for now justice had been served, yet he knew that mystery rarely ended so neatly. There were always shadows left unexplored, reactions unmeasured, and motives only partially revealed. Barbur. The faintest of traces, the smallest discrepancy, or even a quiet message could spark the next unravelling. With a final glance at the village he had protected and observed for so long, Hamish Macbeth adjusted the collar of his coat and set off toward the hills. The snow drifted softly behind him, and as he walked, he allowed himself a small private smile. There were still questions, subtle clues, and the faintest suspicions lingering like ghosts in the corners of his mind. Lochdu's Christmas morning had been ruined, twisted, and resolved, but the story, like the snowflakes swirling in the cold wind, was never truly finished. Hamish knew, as he disappeared over the ridge, that the quiet village, the hidden motives, and the clever minds behind them would keep him alert, ready, and ever watchful. One mystery had ended, but the next, quietly waiting in the shadows, had already begun.